I'd like to welcome everyone to our presentation today. My name is Wendy Rockwell. I'm president of the International Union for Land Value Taxation. We will be talking today COVID and the corruption of economics and medicine. We initially programmed for Ibrahima Drame to join us. He may not be able to, which we much regret. And so we will be hearing Alanna Hartzok, and she will trace the common link between the early corruptions in the United States economic and healthcare systems, how this has led to a serious physical, mental, and social problems, and what we can do about it. Our co-sponsors are Council of Georgist Organizations, Robert Schockenbach Foundation, Earth Rights Institute, Center for the Study of Economics, Public Revenue Education Council, the Better Cities Committee, School of Cooperative Individualism, CONFED, and the Lay Society. With Alanna Hartzok is the administrator of the International Union, and I would like to invite her to start at this moment.
Okay, and I do want to say that I'll continue through the PowerPoint slides. If you have comments, you can put it in the chat, and then comments and questions, we'll look at chat thereafter. So welcome everybody. Here's the outline for the presentation: corruption of medicine first, health and wealth inequality, COVID and wealth inequality, then the corruption of economics, and then restoring the human-earth connection. I had about 4 other topics, but I realized I already was up to about 100 slides. And so there'll be another forum that covers those issues, which has to do with nutrition, food, agriculture, the badly structured economy and how that affects our health. And it's probably going to look at a really hot topic, which is about the COVID vaccines. But I had so much information, I couldn't cover all that. That'll be an upcoming one. So corruption of medicine. Now, let me mention another reason I wanted to put these 2 corruptions together, medicine and economics. I have friends and colleagues who are very familiar with the corruption of economics, but not with the story of the corruption of medicine. Some of them, a couple of them came down with cancer, or they've had other diseases. They just went mainstream medicine. They were not at all into looking at alternatives, and they died. So I think it's really important that we see the connections between these 2 corruptions. So splashing down this big octopus in front of your face, that will give you a hint of the direction we're going for part of this. This section draws from the Rockefeller-Carnegie Big Pharma scam, the killing of natural medicine, and the real history of modern medicine, the dirty, big pharma truth, and email communications I've had with Larry Fishman on the Action Greens email list. I'm going to just quickly, hi, we're starting the program. So, robber barons and the American Medical Association, present day modern medicine created by the robber barons, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie and others, and the American Medical Association to peddle pharmaceuticals which began as byproducts of oil refinement. In order to understand our current medical system, it is useful to take a look back at the history of medicine in the United States. The business story of Western medicine in the modern sense starts with John David Rockefeller. He's probably the most famous for securing a monopoly in America's oil market, but many people haven't heard the story of his other business interests. By the turn of the 20th century, Rockefeller controlled 90% of all petroleum refineries in the Americas through ownership of Standard Oil, which was later split into Mobil, Chevron, etc. Concurrently, around 1900, the science world was getting excited about new petrochemicals and the ability to create a variety of new compounds from oil. Some of the first products derived were plastics, but organic chemists knew that oil had the potential to create far more than plastic bags. During the same era, scientists were doing groundbreaking work to understand the basic mechanics of life and human health. It was during this time that most of the essential vitamins were discovered, and there's a list of them there. And by identifying these vitamins, science took a huge step forward and enabled simple vitamin remedies to cure conditions that were caused by vitamin deficiencies, such as scurvy and rickets. Of course, scientists were also involved in research to recreate synthetic versions of these vitamins in a laboratory. In 1935, vitamin C became the first vitamin to be artificially synthesized in Switzerland. Rockefeller was smart enough to see this as a big opportunity with the possibility that vitamins and medications could be developed from petroleum. He saw the chance to control and monopolize multiple industries at once: petroleum, chemical, and medical. And of course, petrochemicals were ideal from a business perspective because they could be patented, owned, and sold for high profits. But there was a big problem with his plan. Natural and herbal medicines were very popular in America during the early 1900s. Almost half the medical colleges and doctors in America were practicing holistic medicine, using extensive knowledge from Europe and Native American traditions. Rockefeller knew that to get total control of the medical industry, he would have to expunge the competition. So to start, Rockefeller used his vast oil monopoly to purchase part of the German pharmaceutical company, IG Farben. That's the same company that would later assist Hitler in manufacturing chemicals for war. Now that he controlled a drug manufacturing company, he could proceed with getting rid of his competition. So in the early 1900s, as I said, there was a variety of these healing modalities in America. There was chiropractic, naturopathy, homeopathy, holistic medicine, herbal medicine. To eliminate the competition, Rockefeller hired a contractor named Abraham Flexner to submit a report to Congress in 1910. This report concluded that there were too many doctors and medical schools in America, and that all the natural healing modalities which had existed for hundreds of years were unscientific quackery. The report called for the standardization of medical education, whereby only the AMA, American Medical Association, would be allowed to grant medical school licensure in the United States. Abraham Flexner was hired by John D. Rockefeller to evaluate the effectiveness of the therapies being taught by medical colleges and institutions, with the ultimate goal of dominating control over pharmaceuticals. Flexner helped pave the way for a medical monopoly that persists to this day. What he did at the behest of the robber barons, because Carnegie came in as well, he did so in favor of profits rather than the long-term care of patients. He effectively created a culture that enabled the monetization of medicine like never before. This might not have been his intent, but the outcome speaks for itself. Well, while it did have some valid points, unfortunately, the motives for the report were entirely driven by Rockefeller's desire for complete control of the medical system. Based on the report, Congress acted upon the Flexner's recommendations and changed laws related to medical practice. Incredibly, allopathic medicine became the standard modality, even though at the time its main treatment methods were bloodletting surgery, the injection of toxic heavy metals like lead and mercury to supposedly displace disease. The Flexner report was the manifesto of a program that by 1936 guided $91 million from the Rockefeller General Education Board, plus millions more from other foundations, to a select group of medical schools. 2/3 of these funds went to only 7 schools. The Flexner report was conveniently titled Medical Education in the United States and Canada. It more successfully legitimated the profession's interest in limiting the number of medical schools and the supply of physicians than anything the AMA might have put out on its own. I need to see some participants coming in. Excuse me a minute. The report recommended closing schools, competing therapies, and minority doctors that were considered substandard. Medicine would never be a respected profession until it sloughed off its coarse and common elements. The result, after peaking at 160 medical schools in 1906, by 1922, the number had been cut in half. The Flexner report recommended that the number of schools be reduced to 31. Capital requirements now for modern laboratories and libraries and clinical facilities were what killed so many medical schools in the years after 1906. Left up to Flexner, 20 states would not have had a single medical school. Legislation did intervene to some degree. Tone deaf medicine. Medicine has become tone deaf to the oath it claims to uphold, the Hippocratic Oath. Flexner paved the way for this overthrow of whole body health by making scientific research and training alone the only desirable and credible approach to human wellness. In short, the Flexner report hijacked natural medicine. Much like Galileo's critics, the medical industry has, in a lot of ways, created a list of heretics that they'd like to get rid of, and natural medicine practitioners would be on the list. Thanks to Flexner, the AMA, and state licensing, today's healthcare cartel is no laughing matter. The hijacking of natural medicine by present-day modern medicine was the result of the Flexner report on medical education. And all that Rockefeller money. While these legal changes in place, Rockefeller teamed up with Andrew Carnegie, started funding medical schools all over America on the strict condition that they only taught allopathic medicine. Through the power of their huge grants, this powerful team systematically dismantled the previous curricula of these medical schools, removing any mention of the healing power of herbs or natural treatments. Teachings on diet and other natural non-drug treatments were also completely removed from the medical programs. Understand that to become a medical doctor, you only have about 4 hours of education on nutrition and diet. After removing traditional medicine from the schools, Rockefeller made sure to secure his monopoly by launching a targeted smear campaign against his competitors. Homeopathy and natural medicines were discredited and demonized through the newspapers and other media of the time. Some doctors were even jailed for using natural medicine treatments, including treatments that had been used safely and effectively for decades before. In a very short time, medical colleges were all homogenized. All the students were taught the same allopathic dogma, and medicine was now defined as a process of prescribing patented drugs. A pill for an ill became the mindset of American medicine. The burgeoning cartel meant a skewing of the entire medical profession away from patient care toward high-tech, high-capital investment in rare and glamorous diseases. And the transition was made from the household to the market as the dominant institution in the care for the sick. In addition to increased specialization of labor, this created emotional distance between the sick and those responsible for their care, and a shift from women to men as the dominant figures in the management of health and illness. I mean, women were not allowed in these medical schools. In short, the diligent work of Rockefeller and Carnegie was a smashing success. They crushed the underfunded grassroots competition and created our current medical system. The system continues today, where Big Pharma makes large donations to medical schools in exchange for teaching the medical students to use their patented drugs. As part of the system, many alternative treatments are criminalized. For example, by law, it is illegal to treat cancer with any modality except chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation. It's actually a criminal felony for a medical practitioner to treat cancer with anything but these three modalities. And why is this the case? Follow the money. The average cost of cancer treatment is $150,000. So clearly Rockefeller and his presidents were keen to keep the monopoly on this one. and up to the current time. And of course, the American Cancer Society was founded by none other than John David Rockefeller. Hopefully, this narrative will shed a bit of light on the history of our current medical system. At the very least, we can all be surprised. Let's be less surprised when patients are treated like customers and when medications cost thousands of dollars per month. We should also not be surprised we are faced with the fact that the cost of medical care in America rated number 1. Yet the quality of our medicine care is rated at number 37. Unfortunately, these are the natural effects that occur when our medicine system is run like one of Rockefeller's corporations. Eric Schmidt comment. This is the last slide in this section, but I think this is a really excellent YouTube presentation I would urge you to watch. It's Overdosed America, an interview with Dr. Abramson. There's the link. Drawing on his background in statistics, epidemiology, and health policy, John Abramson, an award-winning family doctor on the clinical faculty at Harvard Medical School, reveals the ways in which the drug companies have misrepresented statistical evidence, misled doctors, and compromised our health. The good news is that the best scientific evidence shows that reclaiming responsibility for your own health is often far more effective than taking the latest blockbuster drug. And that blockbuster drug term, it doesn't mean that that drug is enormously safe and effective. What it means is it makes a lot of money. Health and wealth inequality. How do inequality and health relate? Increasing evidence from scientists the world over indicates that many health outcomes, everything from life expectancy to infant mortality and obesity, can be linked to the level of economic inequality within a given population. Greater economic inequality appears to lead to worse health outcomes. By greater inequality, epidemiologists, the scientists who study the health of populations, don't just mean poverty. Poor health and poverty do go hand in hand, but high levels of inequality, the research shows, negatively affect the health of even the affluent, mainly because, researchers contend, inequality reduces social cohesion, a dynamic that leads to more stress, fear, and insecurity for everyone. So begins a series of charts and graphs, this showing that people live longer in more equitable countries. We will not take the time to really study each of these closely right now. You can, when this is posted on YouTube, you can of course pause any of these graphs and really study them, or you can look them up for more details online. More unequal nations have higher infant mortality. Gaps between top 10% and bottom 90% versus infant mortality from 2017. Now you see there at the bottom, Iceland has the lowest and the United States is the highest. In 2017, nations with the smallest income gaps between households at the 90th and 10th percentiles, as calculated by the OECD, had significantly fewer infant deaths. And according to WHO data, than other nations. A household at the 90th percentile had more income than 90% of households. The United States is at the extreme end among industrialized countries, with the largest gap between the rich and the rest of the population, and by far the worst infant mortality rate at 5.7 per 1,000 live births, compared to just 1.6 per 1,000 in Iceland. Nations with low income concentration have happier populations. We'll figure that out. But they are able to make this kind of correlation. Here's some details. Extreme inequality appears to affect how people perceive their well-being. In nations where the top 1% hold a greater share of national income, people tend to have a lower sense of personal well-being, according to University of Oxford Said Business School research. Researchers are also finding links between inequality and mental health. Countries with larger rich-poor gaps have a higher risk of schizophrenia incidences. And in general, a 0.2% increase in a country's Gini coefficient, that's a measure of wealth inequality, results in 8 additional incidences of schizophrenia per 100,000 people. Researchers believe that higher inequality, undercuts social cohesion and capital, and increases chronic stress. The very richest live 10 to 15 years longer than the poorest. So this shows US expectancy by gender, top 1% and bottom 1% of household income groups. The life expectancy divide is widest among the very richest and poorest in the United States society, according to that same JAMA study. Men in the top 1% of the income distribution can now expect to live 15 years longer than those in the bottom 1%. For women, the difference is about 10 years, an effect equivalent to that of a lifetime of smoking. Just to flash here, this very dramatic distribution of family wealth chart. You'll see by the time you get to that higher income, there's very few families. The charts go so high, some of them you can hardly put it on one page. Distribution of net worth in the United States. That's a 2007 one I grabbed. The net wealth of many people in the lowest 20% is negative because of debt. By 2014, then, the wealth gap had deepened. Top 1%, 35% of the wealth. The bottom 40% has minus 1% because of the debt. People live longer in more equitable United States states. So life expectancy versus inequality by states. This is 2016. So they've actually compared the life expectancy with the wealth inequality state by state. So the next part of the narrative tells you about Mississippi and Hawaii. Within the United States, people live longer in the more equal states. It's calculated by Journal of the American Medical Association. In Hawaii, which has relatively equitable income distribution, according to Census Bureau Gini coefficients, people can expect to live nearly 7 years longer than in highly unequal Mississippi. The American Psychological Association published a report which shows that US households with annual incomes below $50,000 report higher levels of stress than other families. Average stress levels gradually declined after the 2007 to 8 financial crisis, but the stress gap between rich and poor households has been increasing since then. Blue-collar and low-income jobs are often more stressful and physically demanding than white-collar jobs. This contributes to a variety of other health problems, such as high blood pressure, back problems, and diabetes. Societal forces, such as discrimination based on race, gender, and sexual orientation, add to the stress level of certain population groups. COVID and wealth inequality. This is a picture of a homeless area, homeless camp in our once wealthy state of California. The COVID-19 crisis has also had differential impact among various racial and ethnic groups. Inequities in the social determinants of health, income and wealth, healthcare access and utilization, education, occupation, discrimination, and housing are interrelated and put some racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk of contracting and dying from COVID. Inequities in infectious disease outcomes are the byproduct of decades of government policies that have systematically disadvantaged Black, Hispanic, and Native communities. For example, as a result of policies that have helped to determine the location, quality, and residential density for people of color, Black and Hispanic people are clustered in the same high-density urban locations that were most affected in the first months of the pandemic. In addition, Black people and Native American people disproportionately use public transit, which has been associated with higher COVID-19 contraction rates. Relatedly, those demographic groups came into the crisis with a higher incidence of pre-existing comorbidities, including hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease, which also increased one's risk of contracting, dying from COVID-19. Compared to white, non-Hispanic Americans, Black Americans are 2.6 times more likely to contract COVID and 4.7 times more likely to be hospitalized as a result of contracting the virus, and 2.1 times more likely to die from COVID-related health issues. While non-Hispanic white people are dying in the largest numbers, because it's the majority of the population, Black and Hispanic people are dying at much higher rates relative to their share of the US population. Moreover, this disparity is true for every age group. So here are two side-by-side charts from Brookings, COVID death rates by race and ethnicity, February through August of 2020, and then COVID death rates by race and ethnicity and by age. Now we have the age factor, of course, pretty significant one. And so like I said about the other charts, we won't be taking a lot of time to study any of these in details, but I think you can quickly get the point by seeing the charts, and you can add up on Brookings, and the other charts are all referenced. You can look them up online. Okay, so the next series of slides are from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's the COVID Hardship Watch, updated December 4th. 1 in 6 adults with children household lacked sufficient food in last 7 days. Black and Latino households likelier to experience food insufficiency during the pandemic. I mean, to just look at those percentages and think of that percentage of people hungry, malnourished, insecure about their food supply in the United States. 1 in 6 renters are not caught up on rent during the pandemic, with Black renters facing the greatest hardship. So there's that graph. All adults, 17%, not able to keep up with the rent. 1/3 of African Americans, and very high on the rest. Nearly 1 in 4 renters living with children are not caught up on rent. So imagine the stress in these families, the family system and the children, what they're going through, how that's affecting their mental and physical health. To be afraid you're going to be evicted. So as we know that as this picture shows, medic loads a sick nursing home resident with COVID symptoms into an ambulance in Austin. We know, I think we all know that this is a most urgent, dangerous disease for the elderly. And now we've learned that it's more dangerous for those on the lower spectrum of wealth. And of course, the pre-existing symptoms related to poor health care and poor nutrition. So Bill Krigley gives us from several sources tragic facts about COVID-19. 87 million workers will lose federally mandated sick leave at the end of December unless there's a change in the law. 50 million are now facing hunger at least once a month. 30 million are facing eviction as of December 31st, 2 days after Christmas, 4 weeks away, when the current Centers for Disease Control moratorium on evictions ends. There's been a 70% increase in the number of people paying their rent by credit card. 16 million unemployed workers have already lost or will lose their federal unemployment benefits by December 26th. 4.4 million have already exhausted their benefits. Another 12 million stand to lose their unemployment benefits by December 26th, unless Congress passes new laws, according to the Century Foundation. We're at a cusp, aren't we? As many as 12 million people who were entitled to the $1,200 stimulus never even received it. 2 major national firms and several national restaurant chains received $10 million each from the Paycheck Protection Program. But more than 25% of the $500 billion in aid went to just 1% of borrowers. 7 million more Americans, about 11%, now live in poverty than did months ago when the $600 federal pandemic unemployment compensation program was operating. I mean, you just think of that. Population of New York City, what is about 10 million? And here's a 7 million increase in poverty. Since January, 2.2 million women have lost or quit their jobs or are no longer working for work because mothers have been forced to choose between caring for their children and their jobs. And of course, now with children not in school, it's of course the incredible pressure. So you lost that the two-family income for millions of people. Off the record high, 1.5 million homeless children in the United States. Over 400,000 have dropped off their school's radar during the pandemic. 1,400,000 children have tested positive for COVID. Well, that's significant when we're here that children don't get it very often. It's still, they still are getting it. But again, this is likely to be children with compromised immune systems. 110,000 restaurants have closed permanently. Failure rates in math and English jumped 600% among low-income students in some school districts recently in Maryland. Nationally, grade school students are falling significantly behind in math, and the percentages may even be worse because a large percentage of students were not even present when testing was done. Several states report that many fewer children enrolled back in school this fall than were a year. COVID rates are 400% higher in state and federal prisons than among the general public, and the death rate is more than twice as high. %400. Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans are 4 times as likely to be hospitalized for COVID than whites. The risk of being exposed to COVID at the grocery store is twice as high in low-income neighborhoods as in high-income neighborhoods. African Americans are 37% more likely to die from COVID than whites, Asians 53% more likely, and Hispanics 16%. There has been a 31% increase in mental health emergency room visits for children since the pandemic began, and an overall 24% increase in emergency room visits. College applications are down 16% from first-generation students or low-income students. And in 13 states, the unemployment benefits provided fall below the federal poverty, $245 a week. So new research shows pandemic profits of billionaires could fully fund $3,000 stimulus checks for every person in America. Wow, imagine a family of 4 getting a $12,000 check. Wouldn't that be helpful? Not going to happen. America's 651 billionaires have gained so much wealth during the coronavirus pandemic that they could fully pay for this one-time $3,000 stimulus checks for every person in the United States and still be better off than they were before the crisis. In the nearly 9-month period between March 18 and December 7th, American billionaires gained more than $1 trillion wealth as people across the US lost their jobs, their businesses, their homes, and their lives. The collective net worth of US billionaires now sits just above $4 trillion, nearly double the combined wealth owned by the bottom 50% of the American population. The updraft of wealth to the billionaire class is disturbing at a time when millions face eviction, destitution, and loss, said Chuck Collins of the Institute for Policy Studies and co-author of Billionaire Bonanza 2020. A report looking at pandemic profiteering and billionaire wealth. Billionaires are extracting wealth at a time when essential workers are pushed into the viral line of fire. Corruption of economics. We're going to do a history of economics, and we're going to see when it was moving along with truth and when it was corrupted and how. So the origin of economics in our time, what we call classical economics, was in France with the French physicians called the physiocrats. They were the medical doctors for the king and the aristocrats. Because they were such and they were smart guys, they studied the flow of blood and other fluids. They began to study the flow of wealth through France and the French economy. So these are three well-known ones: Francois Quesnay and Robert Jacques Turgot, Victor Roquette de Mirabeau. Physiocrats coined the phrase l'impôt unique, the single tax, and urged the French kings to levy taxes on land instead of labor. One of the Enlightenment's wise men, Mirabeau the Elder, held that their discovery would be, if enacted, a social advance equal to the inventions of writing and money. Henry George wrote that the most accurate translation of the phrase laissez-faire, but it also, the full phrase was laissez-faire, laissez-aller, is a fair field and no favor. It's sort of been meant to understood as free markets, untaxed production. Okay, untaxed, a fair field and no favor. He really was about a fair field and no favor. The Confucius of Europe. Why did Francois Quesnay, leader of the physiocrats, become known as the Confucius of Europe during his lifetime? Well, the influence of the Chinese upon the physiocrats were probably more extensive and significant than has generally been appreciated. If one will but look into the matter, he can readily discern the similarities in thought on the part of Chinese sages and French economists. This similarity is more than mere coincidence. It is due to an actual borrowing on the part of the physiocrats. Okay, so this idea of taxing land instead of labor, the physiocrats did not just dream it up themselves. This is showing, we've recently learned, that this is really coming from ancient Chinese systems when the Chinese systems were fair. Land, labor, capital. These were the three factors of production. Land means surface land and all natural resources, meaning water, meaning minerals, oil, all natural, everything that's nature given in classical economics comes with the term land. Labor is pretty easy, that's people. Capital, it's not money. We're just looking at the tools, hammers and factories and such. Wealth that's used to create more wealth is capital. So here, land, okay, we see paddies, agricultural land with water, another natural resource. We see a neighborhood digging down in the ground for who knows what, making a foundation, but what do you find when you dig down in the ground? You find minerals and oils and so on. And you see a nice park in a city, a public park that we want to keep public parks, but all surrounding it is these very high value land sites under the big buildings, which in our current system, commercial building, corporate skyscraper in New York City, for instance, finds a way to write off their property tax requirements through depreciation. They declare depreciation of the building, significant amounts, and then they pay less than their fair share in the property tax. Labor, physical labor, mental labor. Land, labor, capital. Tools of production. Factory building, commercial building. Pretty easy to understand, really. Labor, physical and mental on land, gifts of nature, yields capital, the tools. Basic needs can be secured with minimal capital. It really doesn't take too much capital to grow a lot of food in your backyard if you have a backyard. Factors of production receives a portion called this. Land receives rent. Now, this is the special term of rent in classical economics. This is the return to the owner of land, rent. A guy saying, pay the rent or you leave. That's the power of the landlord. The labor receives wages. We pretty much understand that. And the capital, when we talked about tools, that wealth which is used to create more wealth creates interest. We're not talking at this point about monetary interest. We're talking about capital as tools. So the classical economic terms for how wealth then gets returned are distributed to the owners of the three factors. To the owner of land and resources, natural resources, they receive rent. If you're working, mental, physical labor, wages. If you're owning capital, interest. Now, some people own the land, some corporations own the land, and they own the capital. They're receiving both rent and interest. But it's very important for our purposes of having a fair, free economy and addressing the wealth distribution issue at its source. It's extremely important that we keep these land, labor, capital, wages, rent, and interest factors separate. So here's another way to see this. The worker is standing on land and he's pushing a wheelbarrow. That's his capital. And if he owns all those things, he can collect the rent and the wages and the interest. But if he only has his labor, he'll have to pay someone for the land. And if he needs a lot of fancy capital, he's going to have to maybe pay to rent the capital, or he's going to have to go into a lot of debt to get hold of that capital. But neoclassical economics has reduced this classical economics to only two factors, labor and capital. Land, which is all the earth resources, was made a subset of capital. So now the whole earth is under the hammer, literally. The earth and the ethics around the earth and anything to do with sharing the earth or sharing the values created from using the resources of the earth is now not part of the equation. There's only labor and capital. And when the factor of land is reduced to a subset of capital, what happens to the concept of rent? The question of who owns the resources, whose land values are rising, who's able to get this income. It verschwindet, German word for disappears. Rent magically and perhaps conveniently disappears from the economic lexicon and praxis. So here's a chart that shows what happens when in the neoclassical economics, corrupted economics, and you take rents and land as a factor out of the equation. So this chart's just comparing wages and productivity growth. It excludes the rent factor. So you can't really see if you're only having hourly compensation of labor and you're comparing that, you're calling productivity, but if you're an owner of vast amounts of oil and mineral resources or valuable urban land, you're just owning it. You're charging rent to people who are using it often. And that's being counted as productivity. That's a little indicator here of the way you can't really get a handle on what's happening with the two-factor economics of neoclassical economics. So there's a crime scene here. Who would have pulled such a trick on the promising science of political economy just at the point when it had found a way to structure a market economy that would be fundamentally equitable in its distribution of wealth? Cui bono? Mason Gaffney answers this question, which he also asks in his book, The Corruption of Economics. So we're going to go a little deeper on what happened to rent and land. And first, another little dip into the classical economics in Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. He says both ground rents and the ordinary rent of land are a species of revenue which the owner in many cases enjoys without any care or attention of his own. Ground rents seem in this respect a more proper subject of peculiar, meaning at the time's particular specific taxation. Nothing can be more reasonable than that a fund which owes its existence to the good government of the state should be taxed peculiarly. In other words, the better civil society is, the better the state, the more productive, the more secure, the higher goes the ground rents. And the wealthier becomes those who just own land resources. So, you know, Adam Smith got this and he made this statement. This is what the physiocrats were saying. And this was what classical economics was talking about. But he didn't talk about land in great because his patron was this Duke named Buccleuch, this Scottish big landowner. So he couldn't bite the hand that fed him. So this socializing land rent, aka the land value taxation, is, I have come to discover, it's a perennial wisdom for a fair society. So we're going to take another step historically, way back to economic principles in the Vedic tradition. Dr. Nicholas Kasanis is a Greek-born scholar of Vedic history, Indology, and the culture in the Indus River Valley back to 5,000 years ago. This was one of the three great centers of civilization at that time, not as well known as the others, but very important, and this is what he studied. Tells us that the work of wise lawgivers in the remote antiquity of the Vedic period shows the same concern about the distribution of wealth that occupies the mind of modern economics. The sages who instituted their laws recognized fully all the needs for bodily wholeness, food, shelter, locomotion and assembly, property and reputation, solitude and peace, physical work and spiritual development. Hey, they were people, after all, just like us. The most surprising feature is the principle of free access to land for all and the land value tax, which should be the source of government revenue and expenditure. It is surprising because land value taxation is supposed to be a fairly modern concept. There is a concept of rent or surplus and a higher charge on the more fertile land. Okay, they didn't have these huge cities. They weren't charging on location values. That location value charge was also covered in the Jubilee Justice teachings. The biblical Jubilee Justice and some of the interpretations in the Torah have the rabbis actually talking about the importance of having a fair system by having those who have locations that are closer to the markets in the towns pay those who have to take their goods further to go to market, pay a fee. That's very similar to our land location, land value tax. Henry George, Progress and Poverty, the great masterwork of the latter 1800s that caused a sensation and a very big impact on populist and progressive movements for 40 years thereafter. It's not enough that men should vote. It's not enough that they be theoretically equal before the law. They must have liberty to avail themselves of the opportunities and means of life, and they must stand on equal terms with reference to the bounty of nature. Equal terms. I believe that says we have a birthright to the earth, that if we're going to have real freedom and justice, we have to acknowledge that human beings have equal right to the land and resources of the earth. So we've seen that labor uses land and natural resources to make capital to further enhance the production of wealth. And when land is owned by a few instead of the many, the exploitation of labor begins and wealth inequality grows. This exploitation really is what Henry George was searching to understand. He was seeing San Francisco when it was really a small frontier town, but then he saw it grow and develop as more people came. But he saw the rich poor gap growing in San Francisco as he had seen it in his birth city of Philadelphia and other older cities, even cities in India where he traveled as young and so forth. He was really burning with the desire to try to understand what the heck is going on. Why doesn't wealth distribute more equitably as wealth grows? So Henry George came to really see the land problem, that treating the land and resources as the market commodity and allowing few to own so much and therefore charge the rent is the root cause of this wealth inequality problem. The corruption of economics, we'll talk more about that. Mason Gaffney really did the research work on this history. And he shows better than I can do so here in this short time with you. He shows who did what where, and what universities and how to destroy classical economics, just at the point where Henry George had discovered and was building mass movements about land value taxation to address wealth inequality and the plight of the workers. So Mason shows in the corruption of economics exactly what happened to Henry George. So Mason has done this work on the hidden taxable capacity of land and enough to spare, because another way that they destroyed Henry George's economics and the three factors of land, labor, capital, they said, oh, there's not enough income from land. There's not enough rent to really fund government in any significant way. So they hid the numbers. So Gaffney showed that conventional data relied upon by most economists hides or underestimates land values and land rent, giving the false impression that the tax capacity is low. He describes 16 elements of land's taxable capacity that are either trivialized or omitted from the national income and products account and other data sources. He says any one of these 16 elements indicates a much higher land-based land tax base than economists commonly recognize today. Keepers of the national accounts keep deluding us that land rent and land value are trivial. Here's a chart, very helpful. 100 years of land, labor, capital, looking at this rent phenomena in Australia from 1911 to 2010. Just look at the little gray band at the top. It begins with land and resource rent is only 8%. But what happens, slide forward 100 years as there's an increase in production of wealth, the land and resource rents increasing, showing 26%, a little tiny percent already being captured. So that makes really land and resource rent at 28%. Taxation at all levels of government went from 6% to 24%. Now that's going to take a chunk out of what? The net incomes of labor and productive capital. I'm not meaning financial capital, talking about productive capital. So the net incomes of labor and productive capital went from 85% to 48%. So labor and production are actually losing ground, the return to labor and legitimate capital. And resource rent is growing, but taxes are falling on the factors of production for the most part. So if you were to, which we advocate, take the tax off of the labor and productive capital and collect it on land rent, it would both increase the return to labor and production, and you wouldn't have to have any other taxes if you're collecting the land rent. So that's how, if you could get this in a short graph, I think this is true. This is called pre-distributive justice. Arrange the returns to land, labor, and capital in such a way that you have a fair distribution of wealth set up in the beginning. You don't have to have this terribly unfair distribution that you have to claw back wealth from top. Joseph Stiglitz is an advocate for this land value tax policy. He says in their simplest form, rents are nothing more than redistributions from one part of society to the rent seekers. Much of the inequality in our economy has been the result of rent seeking because to a significant degree, rent seeking redistributes money from those at the bottom to those at the top. Rent seeking distorts resource allocations and makes the economy weaker. It's a centripetal force. The rewards of rent seeking become so outsized that more and more energy is directed toward it at the expense of everything else. Now, no doubt by now, some of you have in your mind, like, what's happening? These billionaires or Bezos and Gates, and they're getting their money from information technologies, aren't they? What's that have to do with land? We're going to have another session on this. It has to do with the enclosure of intellectual property rights. The intellectual commons, just as the land commons was enclosed early on, the intellectual commons through the patent system has been enclosed, enabling these people to reap their billions. But you know what? Usually when wealthy people get wealthy, they start investing in land because there's all these real estate trusts around the world that show the best places that you can make the most money in land speculation. So here again, Corruption of Economics, Mason Gaffney, Ed Harrison. It's a really important book everyone should have on their shelf. I read Henry George championed social justice and economic efficiency so successfully that he had to be stopped, and he was. Here's how. With the development of democracy, mind control became the urgent need. Neoclassical economics was the tool. Economics was uprooted from reality, and we are all paying the price today. So the mystery of persistent economic failure can now be explained. Professor Mason Gaffney charges his colleagues with using a theoretical apparatus that is fatally flawed He means neoclassical economics, the system we're under. But he goes further. He accuses the founders of neoclassical economics, the paradigm taught in schools and universities, of acting in bad faith. They distorted the science of economics to protect vested interests and prevented governments from adopting policies that would yield prosperity for everyone. Again, how did it happen? So just a little more on this corruption of economics from Gaffney, corruption of economics, condemning a post-industrial economy to productive periods of economic failure. This thought-provoking book documents how the integrity of economics as a discipline was deliberately compromised in the United States towards the end of the 19th century. Several chairs of economics were funded at leading universities to rebrand economics to justify the unearned income accruing to land and resources, the rent. The tools for this strategy became neoclassical economics, and unlike classical economists like Adam Smith, who described wealth as the product of three factors, land, labor, and capital, the new theorists reduced these to two, labor and capital, thus treating land as capital. This concealed benefits enjoyed by those in receipt of the rent from land. The effect the authors reveal was to deprive professional economists of the ability to diagnose problems, forecast important trends like economic boom, okay, 2008, and prescribe solutions. Now, again, just those who receive the rent from land. Now, land means all natural resources. It means oil. It means coal. It means water. It means the electromagnetic spectrum. I'm going to look a little more at who did this. The same robber barons and elites who corrupted medicine also corrupted economics. They considered the teachings of Henry George to be more of a threat to their great wealth than was Karl Marx. John D. Rockefeller, now we saw him before. We went through the section on the corruption of medicine, that story, the Flexner Report, and so on. Okay, so he funds the University of Chicago in 1892. He picks the first president, who picks the first economist, a neoclassical economist. Chicago is still the lengthened shadow of John David Rockefeller. They are long gone, but the problem they exemplify is as perpetual as the maldistribution of wealth and the corruption of politics. So this is a Chicago school. Often people know about the Chicago school is causing problems in the world, in Chile and so on. What these guys have been doing in this so-called free market approach that creates terrible wealth maldistribution. The recent harvest of neoclassical economics and its derived public policies is a worsening condition of labor. Lower returns to saving, high and rising concentration of wealth and income, rising class division and social problems. Homelessness has risen to new heights, and hunger is still with us. American-based land speculators, especially after World War II, have acquired shadowy titles to mineral holdings around the world under the US military umbrella. Property wields more political power than citizenship. We have other presentations on this whole economic system and how it breeds the military industrial complex and all these perennial wars. For example, there are the example of this concentration. There are now many water service districts in California clothed with the powers and immunities of sovereign governments in which only landowners can govern. And voting is an appropriate proportion to land ownership. Number of American farms has fallen from 6 million to 1 million. The population rose. Agriculture becoming so big with small farmers falling out. You have more and more use of oil and extensive land and less labor. And so you have all these chemically artificial inputs to agriculture we know about, and the problem of glyphosate and the destruction of nutrition and physical health. I have a whole section to present another point on this problem. If you go left, you're probably going to run up against Karl Marx. If you go right, you're going to vilify Karl Marx. But let's look a little bit at Karl Marx and the land issue here. In his third volume of Das Kapital, subtitled The Process of Capital Production as a Whole. Did I repeat that? In Capital, Critique of Political Economy. It was prepared by Frederick Engels from notes left by Karl Marx, and it was published in 1894. So this Das Kapital Part 3 or Volume 3 indicates that Marx had come to understand that capital could not have power and control over labor, where there is a fair system of land tenure. And he also expressed this view in his critique of the Gotha program. Very interesting, because this was how they were organizing to really build a communist society in Europe. This was a Gotha in Germany. And he had a very interesting critique of the program for overemphasizing capital and not saying that that land was an important factor. But he had come to see this articulated later on. So that was after Horst was out of the gate, that Marxism was equated totally with the problem of capital over labor. So he says, as capitalist production develops, landed property acquires the capacity to capture an ever increasing portion of the surplus value by means of its land monopoly, and thereby of raising the value of its rent and the price of land itself. The capitalist still performs an active function in the development of this surplus value and surplus product, but the landowner need only appropriate the growing share in the surplus product and the surplus value without contributing anything to this growth. Well, little known to most Marxists today, he came to recognize towards the end, unfortunately, that land was essential, that you have to deal with the land problem because it's the underlying problem of the monopoly of capital. So who would have thought Karl Marx and Adam Smith are in agreement that rent should be socialized? Now, these are the two great movements that have divided this earth and caused so many wars. What are we fighting over? Communism, capitalism, communism, capitalism. But there is a resolution, there is a synthesis now. We see that there is a very clear way forward in being able to form fair, free markets. And I think this issue of these two big ideologies and their supposed clash has been used to keep the status quo of the 1%, of the billionaire class. We saw both now in this presentation the corruption of medicine and of economics due to the billionaire class wanting to keep their wealth and their essentially unearned incomes. So to bridge this gap that many of us are concerned about in the political situation in the United States, say Republicans and Democrats, we can build a totally out of the box movement and allow us to move forward. So this is my all-time favorite cartoon. Now that we've replaced the left wing with another right wing, boy howdy, we're going to see some flying. And you just see this over and over again. Right, left, Democrat, Republican. It's not getting us anywhere, folks. Nobody's flying anywhere. We're literally grounded. So we're almost at the end of this. This was another powerful statement by Greta Thunberg. This video is below from Common Dreams. She, a few days ago, says, climate and ecological crisis cannot be solved without system change. That's no longer an opinion, that's a fact. System change. She's got to mean deep power relationship change, deep economic change, structural economic fundamental change. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres summed up the situation. Humanity is waging war on nature. Well, if you have a whole economic paradigm that discounts nature, nature's not a factor. The whole land is just capital and labor. And then a few own the capital, a few own the land and resources. They have the minds to just keep accumulating wealth for themselves. They come to wage war on nature. I don't think most of us here in this little gathering right now are waging war on nature directly. I think we're trying to take care of nature in our own very small way. But we know that the bigger forces are waging war on nature. So it's an urgent issue. What are we going to do about it? Because it's affecting the nature all around us. So another great thinker, Thomas Paine, who also got onto this land issue, and learn from the physiocrats. He states that every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. Okay, this is a simple change in property tax. It's taking the tax off of buildings and houses, but it's also taking the tax off of production of labor, productive capital, and focusing it on the land and resource wealth, rents, values. So if we move forward from the classical economists and we include our environmental issues, but we still keep in mind this land rent system, we can build a system of public finance that will strengthen and maximize incentives for the fair distribution of wealth, environmental protection, efficient wealth production, provision of adequate government services, and even peaceful resolution of territorial conflicts, which are usually over land and this is hatching many birds out of one egg. If you really get down and understand what this is about, you can see that you can really do this through this major public finance reform. All these issues can be addressed by sharing the value of the commons rent, socializing the rent, land value taxation. So the rent of surface land sites based on land value will turn the cities around. All these boarded up buildings, it turns them around so that labor and production works to improve the housing stock and people want to stay in those neighborhoods. Emissions, pollution into air, water, or soil, tax pollution. That's taxing those who are hurting the commons. Timber and grazing and mining land use. Huge amount of unearned income from those who simply own those lands. Oil and minerals, water resources, electromagnetic spectrum, and the geoorbital zones, those expensive real estate in outer spaces where you can hang satellites. They can be between the balance point between the moon and the earth, and they can most easily be kept in orbit. There should be charges on the geoorbital zones. So all these are land site domains that we can draw the commons rent from to totally support our basic public needs. And it's such a high amount that we can also, to citizen dividends, direct checks like they do in Alaska with the oil rent, direct checks to each individual as their share of the resource rent to supplement whatever income they might have. So this is a citizen dividends movement, basic income movement. Stephen Schauferman, I see, has joined us, and he's written 2 books about this. While reducing or eliminating taxes on labor create wealth, so we take off taxes on income, the good stuff, untax the good stuff. Take it off of income, especially from wage labor, payroll taxes. Capital of sustainable quality, we want sustainability, we want durability, don't tax it. Take the tax off of sales, especially for basic necessities. And certainly take it off of homes, which we want good homes and other buildings. So let's build a post-COVID economics and a world that works for everyone and all life. That ends the formal part of my presentation. Remember to join us at theiu.org for our newsletter. And we're going to just open this up for questions and comments. I'm going to see if I can get to the chat, or maybe Wendy, you can, if you can look at the chats and see if there's questions or comments from the chat. Let's open it up, and not too many. So just go ahead. There's 10 people. If you have something to say, just start saying. And if I need to moderate it, Wendy will. But just unmute if you want to talk.
All right.
One other element that the petroleum industry has destroyed is hemp, and hemp is something that can be grown in many places on the planet and can provide everything from clothing to toilet paper, to just regular paper, to housing, in all kinds of medical uses as well. But its fiber, I understand, was being developed 100 years ago, and that's why it's called cellophane. But that whole industry was destroyed.
Well, here's how the story I understand. First of all, it's being legalized all over the United States now. I mean, it was legal in Canada and other countries certainly, but it's rapidly coming on again. And the reason that it was destroyed is because of again these major industry, the monopoly of the need for chemicals applied to cotton, and hemp doesn't need these chemicals to grow. So the chemical companies banned hemp by saying that marijuana was driving people crazy and driving people to suicide and so on. And it was also a very racist approach that they used. So the hemp fiber was being used in the sails. That's where cannabis for the sails were coming from centuries ago. So that was very, very, very strong part of the economy until it's the same similar story of how hemp was made illegal by the similar players, these big chemical industries, petrochemicals and so on. But it's coming back, Wendy. Maybe it really is. It's being legalized again. So that's a good news. So
yeah,
just
go ahead.
A brief comment on hemp. It is coming back in a big way, and it is mostly legalized. I know of people growing hemp and starting the small businesses and farms for using hemp products, concrete, oils, chemicals, foodstuffs. Very big in Tennessee and Kentucky and many other places. Changing the subject, I want to thank you for commenting, for the shout out on my books on basic income. And one thing that I found very useful, and I read Mason Gaffney's book years ago and agree with you, Alanna, that it is vital reading for anyone who wants to understand these issues. One thing I found very useful in my writing is to be really careful about the language. The word resources, for example, suggests that nature is just lying around waiting for people to use it, that it's just a source for profit. And so I usually say natural materials and avoid the word resources. And similarly, free market is a propaganda term that, as far as I can tell, was introduced to justify the anti-communism and pro-capitalism dichotomy in the early part of the 20th century. So it's a term that I carefully avoid, because free from what, in the libertarian conservative view, just means free from government regulation, and supposedly free markets are not really free and are never fair. And the great classical book on that is Karl Polanyi, talking about the fact that markets only function when they're regulated by the political system.
That's why if I use the term, if I use it I use fair. I say fair free markets, because fairness.
No, you did say free market a few times during your talk, and
oh, sorry. I tried to say fair free markets, but thanks for that.
Yeah, Alanna, my computer cut off in the beginning, and when I got back on, I missed the beginning because I couldn't get let into the meeting. So I don't know if you dealt with big pharma and all the money going into the vaccines and the suppression of other treatments.
We did. I'm sorry you missed that. You'll have to get it on YouTube. But that was the whole beginning, was the corruption of medicine. It was that story. It looked at Rockefeller. It looked at the Flexner report. It looked at how the legal system was used to ban all the other approaches.
Yeah, I couldn't I kept trying to get in, and finally I got in. But there's a guy there.
Yeah, sorry about that. We're going to hold this in a different format. Yeah.
Okay, there's a 10-minute video of this physician, Pierre Corey, who testified in the Senate on December 8th. And that he has, that he has this group of very highly published physicians, and they went through like intensely through all the literature looking to repurpose existing drugs. And they have this ivermectin that's 12 cents a dose, and like everyone, they gave it to 800 health workers and 0 got sick, and the control group 58, this was in Argentina. And he was very emotional, like people are dying and they're suppressing this. And I don't know if you got into this, but the reason that we're trashing all these is because of the emergency use. Did you do that? All right. Okay.
The ivermectin that you mentioned, I don't know if it was the same or different, but really, really powerful, clear evidence of how it's clearing people of COVID, and it's being repressed, and some other approaches also.
Vitamin D.
I want to do another. I mentioned earlier that I had a lot more material for this, and then I realized I couldn't use all the material I had, but it covered things like the medicines for COVID, the vaccine, the situation, and so on. So maybe we can work on something similar together to really get this information out, because I think, well, I'd like to see a title, to inject or not to inject. That is the question, meaning to take the COVID shot or not, and then to put all this information in a presentation. Because you and I are staying pretty much on top of the problem.
I'm going to write something about informed consent.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be like incredibly careful about the language, how I frame everything. But I know how, I have a sense how to do that. So I'm on it.
Yep.
Just a couple of words, really. Alanna, I was very interested in the history of the medicine in America. I always call it America, not the United States. I like the word America best. So that was useful to me because I live in England, and we have different arrangements for medicine and all that sort of thing. And the COVID epidemic is affecting us as well as worldwide, as we all know. And the vaccine is seen to be a very vital thing at the present for those who it helps those who are at risk of it. And we are, as you know, as you read in the papers, England is distributing the vaccine, the early one, and waiting for all the other vaccines to come on stream, and then we'll all be cajoled into having vaccines unless we're wary of vaccines in themselves. And they're focused at the moment on those at great risk in health, in care homes, and those who are working in hospitals like nurses and all that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to play out in the next month or two. But no one's really asked a question about the virus itself. I mean, it's part of the creation, as it were. There are hundreds and hundreds of viruses. Some are worse than others, and this one seems to be, playing havoc with it, with everyone's current knowledge, which is quite interesting. But it's part of the environment. And from what you in your presentation, you mentioned that it's particularly people are particularly vulnerable in high density populations where they can't avoid getting in touch with close quarters with people. So that seems to be a thing that we can organize a bit better. So we do have space around us. We're not living in each other's throat, as it were. And they seem to be a cure. So the real vaccine really is, don't get caught next to someone who's got it, really. I mean, that might sound a bit naive, but it's that's in here. I live in London, and we haven't been out much for 6 months, really. I go once a week to the supermarket in my car, and that's being condemned by our famous Mayor of London, who's got it against diesels and all that sort of thing. And they're not pursuing a different agenda on that. They're not trying to improve the exhaust emissions. They just want to get rid of it and get us all on electric, which is going to cause also great problems of in itself. You know, cars are becoming unaffordable. I mean, 20 to 30,000 pounds for a new electric car is beyond the reach of the majority of motorists in this country, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an interesting dilemma, really. It's within ourselves to be mindful of each other and try and help each other. And I mean, people are supposed to be wearing masks and keeping distancing, but so many people avoid, just don't do that, you know. So you can be following all the guidelines yourself, but only once one let your guard down a little bit, and you've got it. You and if you're vulnerable, it might kill you, you know. So these are different things. But I was very interested because it's from the American perspective, hearing a bit more about the history of medicine in America, and that was quite interesting. And I like the critique about Quinet and the physiocrats. I didn't get the last one you spoke about. You spoke of Quinet, Turgot, and was it Mirabeau?
Yes, Mirabeau.
Mirabeau. I started to write down the dates for that because I'm pursuing my own little line of research, really, in looking at the history of economics, and the dates particularly important because there is a line that can be followed, and everyone comes up with different solutions all through the ages, and they're all a bit short of complete knowledge, and we're at the end of the line, and we should really have quite a lot of knowledge, but we seem to be failing completely in our understanding of basic knowledge, really. So we've got to go backwards and forwards, and etc. Even Henry George, people, you know, I've started to regard some Georges as Luddites, really. You know, if Henry George hadn't spoken about it, they think it can't be true, or no one else is important, which I find a bit disturbing. So, you know, we've got to look at everything that we read, everyone we listen to with a solution and understanding, so we get knowledge from everyone, right through the ages. No one wants to hurt anybody except a few criminals. You know, they want the best for everyone, and that's how we should proceed, I think, in many ways. But thanks for your presentation. That was excellent information, which I shall dwell upon.
You're welcome, Mike. In my research into the land problem through thousands of years, and the Middle East and China and India and anywhere I could find, there's definite understanding that when there was a fair system by whatever policy, a fair system of access to land and resources in that society, you had a thriving, equitable society. And when you had a few taking most of the land and resources and the rent from the resources, you had social breakdown, you had wealth inequality, you had prisons and crime and so on. And I just find it incredibly consistent to look at history through a land lens. But you also mentioned the origin of COVID, and I'd love to hear other people's views on this, because there's not just one narrative about where it came from, and many believe that it's from a bat. It's been totally discredited, that it came from the Wuhan wet market. Is simply not true, has been evidenced as is not true. There is, on the other hand, some pretty strong evidence that's being repressed. And this is from, I think it's Boyle, maybe if Diane's still here, she'll remember.
Yeah.
Dr. Francis Boyle did the bioweapons treaty and so on. He's top notch on bioweapons. And he said very clearly early on that the indications he had, and he pointed to quite a bit of documents, showed that the bioweapons lab in Fort Detrick, Frederick, Maryland, had been working with these kind of viruses, and they've been upgrading them. And then there was a time when they weren't allowed to upgrade the weapons. And then through Dr. Fauci's auspices and his grants that he'd received, he gave money to the Wuhan level 4 bioweapons lab. And so the Wuhan, it was a probably accidental release from the Wuhan bioweapons lab that had weaponized the coronavirus, and that's what we're dealing with COVID. So
Right.
there are campaigns now to stop the manufacture of bioweapons.
Yeah, it's called a gain of function research
Yes,
to
gain of function.
increase transmissibility to mammals. And so in 2014, they were worried about it. There were a few accidents in CDC. So Obama shut down the program, and then they moved it to Wuhan, and Fauci gave $3.7 million.
Mm.
Is it million?
Fauci himself.
Yeah.
So imagine what if that became the predominant narrative? That narrative is there,
Well, I'm writing
being
an
repressed,
article.
censored.
I'm writing about COVID and human rights now, so I hope to publish it today, and I include that in there. But just one thing, what Michael said before about like staying away from each other is the best vaccine. So they're saying vitamin D is a vaccine, and there's like tons and tons of research that people who have like very mild symptoms have adequate levels of vitamin D, and everyone, who has severe symptoms and is hospitalized and dies has low levels
Right,
vitamin D. And
right.
the reason that incidents are higher in the winter is because we don't have as much sunlight on our skin, and also humidity. And also from what, I'm not big on pharmaceutical drugs, but from what this Dr. Corey said, the ivermectin protects and prevents. And those are available now, and they're cheap. I think we should mandate free vitamin D for everybody. In England, I wrote something about that, and then I saw in the UK, they're giving free vitamin D to people.
Fauci himself mentioned it, I think, once. He said, I myself, I take a vitamin D. I suggest, but he only mentioned it once versus all the push for the vaccine.
Right.
What is that about, Fauci and these, they have profit from patents.
Yeah.
Bill Gates will profit enormously from the COVID patents.
And you talk about Slaoui, Moncef Slaoui, the czar, the COVID czar, that he used to be on the board of Moderna and executive of GlaxoSmithKline, and he has $10 million of stock in GlaxoSmithKline that he won't give up. So.
One thing I find interesting is the fact that the vaccine itself seems to help the immune system in the body somehow, and it encourages our individual immune systems to encourage it to combat it. That's what it appears to me. It's to trying to get to help the immune system that's got a bit off. And so that's an interesting concept. If you're good in good working order, as it were, and everything's working naturally, you're less vulnerable, and you have the equipment on board, if you like. So the vaccine is something to add to that activity, really, I think. But we'll see. This, I'm hoping that someone will pop up with a nice simple solution, like 2 doses of orange juice with a spoonful of sugar would do the same job, as it were. Some natural product that might be completely COVID enemy, really. But until that comes, they seem to be very, very complicated, and the simpler ones will get the market in the end, especially in poorer countries.
Well, Michael, what Diane just said, and I totally agree with her, and maybe we can email you the reams of evidence.
Yeah.
That vitamin D is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
If you have sufficient vitamin D in your system, these studies show that if you do contract COVID, it's not nearly as severe, and you're almost totally unlikely to die from it, unless you have some kind of other compromised health system.
Yeah. No,
I want
agree.
to.
There's a lot of
But
information.
really,
around.
look into just that one vitamin is key.
Yeah.
And it's potentiated with magnesium, selenium, and zinc, and
Right.
melatonin.
Right.
Yeah, if you have a strong immune system, then the virus cannot take hold in the same way. And all of these nutritional approaches can make a huge difference. But the mass media is totally in bed with the conventional model. And this is really the link between where Alanna started with talking about pharma and with the corruption of economics.
Yeah, I think
And the conventional models today in both disciplines and much more generally are that every problem has a specific, unique cause, and that the only way to solve the problem is to identify that cause and to treat it. And what the physiocrats were saying and what the homeopaths and naturopaths and other people who are critical of the conventional medicine are saying is that no, you have to address the whole system and you have to look at all the possible factors. And we have to get away from the old cause and effect disease and treatment models in economics and in medicine and in environmental issues and more fundamentally.
No, I agree with all that. That seems to be, we've got to get our simple way of living organized, and justice and respect for the environment. All that's got to be sort of start to be in place in a good manner, and then that's half the problem solved. All these other things seem to be almost as bad as the the thing you're trying to combat. You create one problem and cure one problem, and end up with another as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I have long operated on the motto that solutions cause problems.
The immune
Trying to
system
solve a
clearly,
specific issue, then you're going to create other difficulties.
yeah, like if you, I mean, the material that I was going to put into the presentation that will have to wait for another time, and many of you are aware of this, is the effect of the food we eat and our immune system. And the food we eat, is it grown organically? What is the soil? That health comes from a healthy soil. And our form of agriculture is destroying the soil microbes that create the health of the plants, that create the health of the humans. So the importance of being able to shift into a system that builds healthy soil, it's called regenerative agriculture. There's a wonderful Dr. Zach Bush, triple certified, board certified medical doctor, who is now totally onto regenerative agriculture. And he is beautiful in his wisdom about the connection of health and soil and food.
And the idea of regenerative agriculture is starting to get a lot of attention politically as well. And a number of people in the Democratic Party and generally on the left are talking about it, including Marcia Fudge, who should have been the Biden Secretary of Agriculture, Tim Ryan, another congressman from Ohio. So these issues are starting to be addressed more broadly, but still only somewhat bit by bit and specific.
Stephen, do you think we can have regenerative agriculture without addressing the land problem and the tax problem?
In a piecemeal way, I think we can move in that direction. But yeah, we have to address all of these issues, and the land problem is obviously fundamental, and the valorization of big corporate agriculture and quantity over quality and profits over people is the core issue.
We have been subsidizing agribusiness. We, the taxpayer, have been giving billions of dollars to big tech agriculture that displaces labor, uses way amount more land and petroleum and oil products to create the crap food that we're getting.
Yeah, well, and that again is the agriculture system has been subsumed by the economic models of just quantity of food primarily for export. So it's
well, then you've got the grains, and people are saying really we've got to eat less grains, and many of us can't eat wheat anymore because it looks pretty clear that it's because the glyphosate that has been sprayed on wheats in order to essentially dry it up and kill it off, to make it more easy to harvest, to make it easier to transport and market. That glyphosate is destroying the tissue of the gut and of the stomach. It is causing leaky gut, so undigested food is getting into the bloodstream and it's causing a lot of havoc to our health. And so I noticed, I mean, there's many different kind of illnesses that are exacerbated or occur because of glyphosate soaked grains. And when I'm not having those grains, I'm going gluten-free, my health is improved, and many people experience it. That's why you see gluten-free so much in the stores now where you didn't used to. So apparently Hippocrates and some of these ancient medical wise people understood the gut health connection, that what you eat, what happens in your gut, and the microorganisms in your digestive system have a lot to do with whether your health is strong or poor. So that's another form of land problem, I think, if you're not if you're not having people have real access to the soil to actually be in touch with healthy microorganisms. And babies, we know that babies are healthier when they've had access to clean dirt when they're young. It strengthens their immune systems early on.
Mm-hmm. We've covered quite a lot, really. I'll just give you something I've been reading recently. I've come across a book called The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. It's about modern monetary theory and all this question of the cost of COVID and all the government billions and billions of funds that are being created out of thin air, as it were, to address some of the practical problems. I mean, she talks in her first chapter about the fact that a federal government is a money issuer, not a money user, and therefore it has unlimited possibility. Anyway, I'm reflecting on that along with many others on this principle that if you're a money user, you have to borrow. If you're a money issuer, you don't have to borrow. But governments seem to be working on the premise that they're money users, not money issuers. And it's an interesting concept, and I'm sure it's in everyone's mind, etc. But I just mentioned that book. It's made a big impression on me anyway. The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, and it's
yeah, I know many people are looking at that. I think we're going to keep our focus here with the International Union for Land Value Taxation, because in our membership we have massive disagreements about the money problem, but we have agreement on the land and tax issue. That's our organizational intention and focus. So unless anybody else has any other comments about this particular presentation today on these themes we've presented, I think I'll suggest that Wendy closes down, and I'll turn off the recorder.
I want to thank all the participants today, and this will be posted on our website. So
and on YouTube.
Yeah, because there's a lot of information, and hopefully this can be used as a resource for future resources for research that we're all working on, I think. And I appreciate hearing about the other projects that are happening. And I appreciate also people sharing links that they think are important. So thank you all.
I just this second got an email from Green Med Info. Warp Speed begins. Coercion, Deceit, Making Informed Choice live stream from Sayurji. It's 1:30 Eastern time.
Okay, maybe we can continue on. Greenmed.info is important.
Yeah,
okay.
And you can forward it to people.
It's a great resource, greenmed.info. Okay, guys, thank you for joining. We'll have another series starting in February. We're going to look at the success of land value tax. We have something a really positive report for a state in Germany. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.